Death does not always arrive with a sword. Sometimes it settles slowly over a nation through compromise, corruption, and forgotten faith. And in the days of King Ahaz, that shadow stretched long across Judah. Jerusalem, once radiant with covenant worship, had become a city divided between the altar of the Lord and the altars of foreign gods. For Ahaz did not walk in the ways of David his father, but followed the practices of the kings of Israel, erecting high places on hilltops and beneath spreading trees, burning incense to idols, and leading the people into spiritual confusion and moral decay. The temple that had once echoed with psalms now bore the stain of desecration. Sacred vessels were mishandled, holy spaces neglected, and the king himself committed the unthinkable. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, offering him to Molech, embracing the detestable customs of the nations the Lord had driven out before Israel. 2 Kings 16, 3-4. This was not merely political failure, but covenant betrayal. And when a nation abandons its foundation, the consequences follow swiftly. The Lord allowed surrounding enemies to rise as instruments of discipline. The Arameans pressed in from one side, the Philistines raided from another, and the northern kingdom of Israel struck down 120,000 soldiers of Judah in a single devastating day. A loss so staggering that Jerusalem trembled behind its walls, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. Yet instead of humbling himself and seeking the Lord, Ahaz doubled down on desperation, sending tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria, stripping the temple of its gold and silver as payment for protection, as though the wealth dedicated to God could purchase security from a pagan empire. The move brought temporary relief, but forged a heavier chain, for Assyria's help came at the cost of submission, and the yoke of foreign influence tightened around Judah's neck. Political compromise became spiritual compromise, and the temple suffered further distortion as Ahaz even copied a pagan altar from Damascus, installing it in Jerusalem and sidelining the altar of the Lord. Leadership shapes destiny, and under Ahaz, the nation drifted far from its spiritual anchor. Yet, even in seasons of decline, God preserves a remnant and prepares unexpected renewal. When Ahaz died and was laid to rest in the city of David, though not in the tombs reserved for honored kings, his son Hezekiah ascended the throne at just 25 years of age. 2 Kings 16:20. Inheriting not a golden age, but a fractured kingdom, spiritually compromised and politically vulnerable. Youth might have driven him toward fear or imitation of his father, but instead, something different stirred in his heart, a conviction that Judah's survival depended not on alliances or tribute, but on restoration of covenant faithfulness. His first act was not to muster armies or negotiate treaties, but to reopen the temple of the Lord, which had been shut in neglect, signaling that national healing must begin with spiritual cleansing. He summoned the priests and Levites, urging them to consecrate themselves and remove every defiling thing from the sanctuary, reminding them that their fathers had been unfaithful and that wrath had fallen upon Judah because they had turned their backs on the dwelling place of God. For 16 days they labored, cleansing chambers, carrying out impurities, restoring sacred order piece by piece until the temple once again reflected holiness. 2 Chronicles 29:17. And as worship resumed, harps and cymbals filled the courts, the songs of David rising like a long-forgotten melody rediscovered, and the people bowed low in humility, sensing the return of divine favor. Revival spread beyond ritual, idols were torn down, altars to false gods destroyed, and Hezekiah's reforms reached into the heart of the nation, calling Judah back to exclusive devotion to the Lord. It was a bold reversal of his father's legacy, a declaration that the throne would no longer be aligned with pagan compromise, but with covenant obedience. Yet such renewal does not go unnoticed in a world governed by power and pride. Assyria, the empire that had swallowed nations and enforced submission across the region, watched closely, and beneath the celebration in Jerusalem lingered a looming question: would this spiritual awakening invite political retaliation? The people rejoiced in restored worship, but beyond their borders, forces were already stirring, and the young king who had chosen faith over fear would soon discover that obedience brings both blessing and opposition, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test whether Judah's newfound revival could withstand the pressure of an empire determined to crush all resistance. Revival had returned to Jerusalem, but beyond the city walls, the machinery of empire was already in motion, and in the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, the storm finally broke as Sennacherib, the mighty king of Assyria, marched south with an army that had already crushed fortified cities and silenced nations. One by one, the strongholds of Judah fell, their walls breached, their defenders slaughtered or carried away, and the smoke of burning cities rose like a grim reminder that Assyria was undefeated and merciless. Lachish fell, and with it much of Judah's outer defense, leaving Jerusalem isolated, a lone fortress trembling under the shadow of the world's greatest military power. Fear gripped the people, and Hezekiah, seeing the devastation, made a decision born of pressure rather than faith. He sent word to Sennacherib at Lachish, saying, "I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand." And the price was staggering, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. To meet the demand, Hezekiah stripped the temple of its treasures and even removed the gold overlay from its doors, handing over what had once symbolized God's glory in exchange for temporary relief. For a moment, it appeared that the threat had subsided, but the peace was an illusion, for Assyria did not intend to honor any agreement. Instead, Sennacherib sent his high-ranking officer, the Rabshakeh, with a massive force to stand before Jerusalem's walls and deliver a message not merely of conquest, but of psychological warfare. Speaking loudly in Hebrew so the people could understand, the Rabshakeh mocked Hezekiah's leadership and ridiculed Judah's faith. "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, neither let him make you trust in the Lord, saying, 'The Lord will surely deliver us.'" And he taunted them with comparisons to other nations whose gods had failed to rescue them from Assyria's grip, declaring that no god had withstood the king of Assyria, and neither would theirs. The people stood on the walls in silence, obeying Hezekiah's command not to answer, but inside the city, hearts pounded and doubts whispered. Egypt could not save them, tribute had not saved them, and now even their God was being publicly challenged. When the report reached Hezekiah, he tore his clothes, covered himself in sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord, a king humbled before heaven, sending messengers to the prophet Isaiah with a desperate plea. "This day is a day of trouble and rebuke and blasphemy. It may be that the Lord your God will hear." Soon another letter arrived from Sennacherib, doubling down on threats and warning Hezekiah not to be deceived by hope. And this time, the king did something extraordinary. He went up to the temple, spread the letter before the Lord, and prayed not for his own reputation, but for God's glory, acknowledging that Assyria had destroyed other nations because their gods were mere wood and stone, but declaring that the Lord alone is the maker of heaven and earth, and asking that deliverance would reveal his sovereignty to all kingdoms. The answer came swiftly through Isaiah. "Because you have prayed to me, I have heard." And a prophecy followed that Sennacherib would not enter the city nor shoot an arrow there, but would return by the way he came, for the Lord himself would defend Jerusalem. Night fell over the besieged city, the Assyrian camp sprawling across the landscape, with tents stretching like a sea of confidence, soldiers resting in arrogant certainty that morning would bring victory, unaware that heaven had already moved in response to a king's prayer. Then, in the darkness, the angel of the Lord went out, and what no army could accomplish, no strategy could achieve, and no alliance could secure, was executed in a single silent act of divine intervention. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers were struck down. At dawn, when the survivors awoke, the camp was a field of corpses, the invincible force reduced to lifeless stillness without a battle cry or drawn sword from Jerusalem's defenders. Sennacherib, the proud ruler who had mocked the living God, retreated in humiliation to Nineveh, and years later, as Isaiah had foretold, he fell by the sword in his own land at the hands of his sons, proving that earthly power bows to divine decree. Jerusalem was spared not by tribute, not by alliance, not by military strength, but by prayer and the sovereign hand of God. And the midnight miracle became a defining moment in Hezekiah's reign, a testimony that when faith replaces fear and surrender turns heavenward, even the mightiest empire can collapse overnight. The echoes of victory had scarcely faded from Jerusalem when a quieter, more personal enemy approached the palace gates. For after witnessing the fall of Assyria's enemy by divine intervention, King Hezekiah now faced a battle no sword could fight and no wall could defend against: his own mortality. A severe illness struck him, sudden and merciless, draining the strength from the king who had once stood firm before emperors, and the same prophet Isaiah who had brought words of deliverance now entered the royal chamber with a message heavy as stone. "Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live." 2 Kings 20, verse 1. There was no ambiguity, no poetic symbolism. This was a decree of death. The man who had reopened the temple, who had trusted God against Assyria, who had seen 185,000 enemies fall in a single night, was now told that his own life would soon end. The weight of that pronouncement pressed into his soul, stripping away royal authority and military triumph until he was simply a man confronted with the inevitability all humanity must face. Yet Hezekiah did not respond with anger or denial. Instead, he turned his face toward the wall, shutting out attendants, advisors, even the prophet himself, and in that private space between despair and faith, he wept bitterly and prayed, "Remember now, O Lord, I pray, how I have walked before you in truth and with a loyal heart, and have done what was good in your sight." 2 Kings 20, verse 3. His appeal was not rooted in pride, but in covenant relationship. He did not bargain with achievements or wealth, but reminded God of his sincere devotion, his reforms, his efforts to restore worship, and his dependence upon the Lord during crisis. The tears of a king fell onto palace stone, but they rose like incense before heaven, and before Isaiah had even left the middle court, the word of the Lord came again with astonishing reversal. "Return and tell Hezekiah, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. Surely I will heal you. On the third day you shall go up to the house of the Lord, and I will add to your days 15 years. 2 Kings 20, verses 5 through 6. Death had knocked, but mercy answered. The decree was rewritten, and time itself was extended by divine compassion. Isaiah returned immediately with the new message, and as a practical act accompanying the promise, he instructed that a poultice of figs be laid upon the king's inflamed boils, a simple remedy used as the conduit of supernatural healing, and gradually strength flowed back into Hezekiah's body, breath steadied, and the shadow of death retreated. Yet, even in relief, the king sought confirmation, asking, "What shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me?" 2 Kings 20, verse 8, not from disbelief, but from a desire for assurance that this extraordinary promise would indeed unfold as spoken. Isaiah presented a choice beyond human comprehension. The shadow on the sundial of Ahaz could move forward or backward 10 degrees, an alteration not of circumstance alone, but of the very measurement of time. Hezekiah reasoned that it was a small thing for a shadow to lengthen as the day progressed, but for it to move backward would defy the natural order entirely, and so he chose the greater wonder. Isaiah cried out to the Lord, and in a moment that stunned the palace and confounded nature, the shadow retreated 10 degrees on the steps of the sundial, reversing its path as though the sun itself obeyed a higher command. 2 Kings 20, verses 9 through 11.
Gasps filled the air. Servants stared in awe. The ordinary rhythm of daylight bent to the will of the Creator, a cosmic sign that the God of Israel governs not only armies and empires, but time itself. This miracle was more than proof of healing. It was a declaration that life and chronology rest in divine hands, that years can be added or subtracted by sovereign decree. On the third day, as promised, Hezekiah rose and entered the house of the Lord, no longer confined to a sickbed, but standing again in worship, carrying within him the profound awareness that he was living borrowed time, 15 additional years granted not by merit, but by mercy. He had seen enemies fall outside his walls. Now he had seen death retreat within them. The extension of his life was both gift and responsibility, a sacred opportunity to steward added days wisely. Yet embedded within the miracle was an unspoken test. Would gratitude produce humility, or would survival breed subtle pride? For now, the king rejoiced in restoration, a living testimony that prayer can alter destiny when aligned with God's will, that tears are not unnoticed in heaven, and that even when the sentence seems final, the author of life retains the final word.
The miracle that restored Hezekiah's life did not remain hidden within the walls of Jerusalem for long. For news of a king healed from the brink of death and of a shadow that had turned backward traveled swiftly across kingdoms, reaching even the rising power of Babylon in the east, where Merodach-Baladan watched world events carefully, seeking alliances and opportunities in the shifting balance of empires. Seeing Assyria momentarily weakened and Judah miraculously preserved, the Babylonian ruler sent envoys with letters and gifts to congratulate Hezekiah on his recovery. But beneath the courtesy lay political calculation, for Babylon was testing the strength of potential partners against their common Assyrian foe. Hezekiah, newly restored and perhaps still exhilarated by divine favor, welcomed them warmly, and what began as diplomacy soon became display. Instead of guarding his heart with humility, he opened the doors of his treasury and showed them everything: the silver and gold, the spices and precious oils, the armory filled with weapons, and all that was found among his treasures. There was nothing in his house or in all his dominion that he did not show them. It was a moment subtle yet significant, a shift from dependence on God to confidence in visible wealth, from testimony of divine mercy to exhibition of material strength. The king, who had once spread a threatening letter before the Lord, was now spreading his riches before foreign eyes, perhaps savoring admiration, perhaps imagining strategic alliances, perhaps forgetting that blessing requires discretion. Soon, the prophet Isaiah arrived, his presence carrying the weight of discernment, and he asked simple but piercing questions. What did these men say, and from where did they come to you? Hezekiah answered casually, they came from a far country, from Babylon. And when pressed further about what they had seen, he replied without hesitation, they have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing among my treasures that I have not shown them. In that admission lay the exposure of pride, and Isaiah, closing his eyes as though hearing an echo from heaven, delivered a sobering prophecy. Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left. The very nation he had sought to impress would one day plunder Jerusalem, and even more painful was the personal consequence. And they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. The words must have pierced deeply, for they foretold not only loss of treasure, but humiliation of legacy, a future exile rooted in a present moment of carelessness. Yet Hezekiah's response was complex and quiet. The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good, he said, adding, for will there not be peace and truth at least in my days? On one hand, his submission acknowledged God's justice and sovereignty. On the other, it revealed a subtle resignation that the consequences would fall beyond his lifetime,
a sobering reminder that leaders may accept peace for themselves while future generations bear the cost of present pride. The contrast could not be sharper. The king who once humbled himself in sackcloth now stood as a man whose success had dulled vigilance. The one who had trusted God completely against Assyria momentarily leaned on human prestige before Babylon. His healing had extended his years, but extended time had introduced new temptations: the temptation to be admired, to secure political favor, to measure stability by visible assets rather than unseen faithfulness. The tragedy was not immediate. Jerusalem did not fall that day, nor were its treasures seized in that hour, but seeds had been planted, and prophecy declared their eventual harvest. Blessing without humility had opened a door that enemies would one day walk through, and the shadow that once moved backward on the sundial now seemed symbolic of a warning. Time granted by mercy can either deepen devotion or expose pride. Hezekiah's story in this chapter becomes a caution woven into a miracle, showing that spiritual victory over external threats does not guarantee victory over internal weakness, and that the heart, even after divine intervention, must remain guarded. For though God had added 15 years to his life, those years would carry both achievement and consequence, and the king who had once faced death with tears now faced the quieter danger of self-satisfaction, proving that the greatest battles are not always fought on open fields, but within the unseen chambers of the human heart.
The final years of Hezekiah's life unfolded not in dramatic siege or desperate illness, but in the steady rhythm of leadership shaped by experience, gratitude, and the quiet awareness that every sunrise was part of the 15 years granted by mercy. Having witnessed both divine deliverance and prophetic warning, he turned his attention to strengthening Jerusalem in practical and spiritual ways, understanding that faith does not eliminate responsibility, but deepens it. He fortified the city's walls, repaired breaches left vulnerable by previous attacks, and constructed towers to guard against future threats. Most notably, he engineered a remarkable water system, redirecting the waters of the Gihon Spring through an underground tunnel into the city so that Jerusalem would have secure access to water even under siege. It was an act of wisdom born from past experience. Assyria had once surrounded them, and preparation was no contradiction to prayer. At the same time, Hezekiah continued to uphold temple worship, ensuring that the priests and Levites were supported, that offerings were restored, and that the spiritual reforms begun in his youth did not fade with time. The king who had reopened the temple doors remained committed to keeping them open, reinforcing the truth that national strength flows from covenant faithfulness. Yet the prophecy concerning Babylon lingered like a distant storm cloud beyond the horizon, a reminder that even forgiven mistakes may cast long shadows into the future. Hezekiah lived knowing that his kingdom would one day face exile, that treasures carefully stored would be carried away, and that descendants from his own line would serve in a foreign court. And though Scripture does not record every thought of his later years, one can imagine the sobriety that such knowledge brings, a king aware that legacy is fragile and that decisions echo beyond a single lifetime. Still, he was honored in his day. When his time finally came, he rested with his fathers, and all Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem honored him at his death, burying him in the upper tombs of the sons of David. He was remembered not as a perfect king, but as a faithful one, a ruler who sought the Lord wholeheartedly, who tore down idols, who trusted God against impossible odds, and who wept openly when confronted with mortality. His life formed a tapestry of contrasts: revival and invasion, miracle and mistake, humility and pride, added years and inevitable death. And within that tapestry lies a profound testimony about the sovereignty of God over life, time, and destiny. Hezekiah's story teaches that prayer is not a last resort, but a powerful turning point, that tears shed before God are never wasted, and that heaven responds to sincere hearts. It also warns that spiritual victory does not grant immunity from human weakness, and that blessings, if not guarded by humility, can become seeds of future trouble. The sundial that moved backward stands as a symbol that God is not bound by natural law or chronological sequence, that He alone commands history's flow. Yet the eventual fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy about Babylon proves that divine mercy does not erase accountability. In Hezekiah, we see a man who faced death and pleaded for life, who experienced supernatural healing and extraordinary deliverance, and who ultimately returned to dust like all who came before him, reminding us that extended time is still finite and that even the most righteous kings must one day surrender their crown. His legacy endures because he turned to God in crisis, led his people in reform, and acknowledged the Lord's hand in both salvation and judgment. And so the story closes not with spectacle, but with reflection. A king lies in honored rest, Jerusalem stands strengthened for a season, and history moves forward toward prophecies yet to unfold. The lesson remains clear across generations. Trust God when enemies surround you, seek Him when sickness threatens you, remain humble when blessings overflow you, and remember that the one who can turn back the shadow of time is also the one who appoints its end.